Think Different Nation is brought to you by InvestOut.net, where we connect homeowners who know that their homes could sell for more if renovated, with investors who are interested in adding that value at no cost to you. Once the home's renovated, you, as the homeowner, sell the home, and the investors make their profit from the increased value of the sale. Find out more at investout.us.
They call me the real-life Batman. My claim to fame is that I click. Our emphasis is in how the blind can help the world. So blind people who are able to step up to the plate choose how and what they want to achieve. They've developed themselves into something, and they've developed the world around them into something. And that is a process that is applicable to everyone.
I learned of my next guest back in 2000 when he appeared on the show Ripley's Believe It or Not under the title of Batman. You see, they called him Batman because Daniel has this unique ability to be able to use, let's just say, clicking sounds out of his mouth, just like a bat or a dolphin would do, to be able to go and communicate out, send out sound waves so that the responding sound waves would help him to understand where he is with respect to his surroundings. And as I started to learn more and more about Daniel, I found this to be fascinating, considering the fact that we all live across the world according to our 5+ basic senses of sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, and hear. I think I said hear twice, but nonetheless, we all go through the world with those 5+ basic instincts, with the 6th instinct being intuition, of course. The thing is, Daniel only has 5. He's missing sight, which means his experiences of the world are quite different, but yet nonetheless quite normal. So in this next interview, you're going to hear Daniel talk about his experiences of being blind, but yet navigating the world in a way that we could never even consider. But Daniel's also in the process of working with other young folks and older folks, teaching everyone how they can additionally experience the world without sight. Now, I was so excited about getting into this interview that I didn't even do a formal introduction, so we're going to just walk right into the observations that Daniel has with respect to his disabilities, and I'd say actually his abilities, because they're far out past most of ours, considering the fact that he has been able to leverage and build up his ability to hear at a rate that very few humans have that ability. But yet he's very much so human, just like the rest of us. So welcome, Daniel Kish. Now, as Daniel first came on the show, the first thing I asked him was, how difficult was it for him to actually develop this skill?
A bit like the difference between learning a language when you're young versus learning a language when you're older. I think it is harder to learn a language when you're older, but lots and lots and lots of people do, and lots of people do become fluent second language users, even though they learned to use a language when they learned a language when they were older. I think it does require a different learning process. I think that different parts of the brain are involved in terms of learning language as a primary function versus a secondary function. I think that people, and this is one of the reasons why I'm such a believer in early blindness training, early mobility, is that I think the earlier you get it, the more primary the skill is learned as a primary function, as a primary brain function. Whereas I think as you get older, it becomes learned as what I would call a secondary function, which doesn't necessarily diminish a person's capacity, but I think it is harder, and I think that people have to work harder to learn it. And secondary functions are coded differently in the brain than primary functions. So, our motto is the earlier, the easier, but it's never too late.
Right, I understand that. Now, considering the fact that you've got such advanced ability with your hearing, and you would say this is that as well, would you not?
I would say that my auditory processing is highly developed.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. That's tremendous clarity. Now, what about, and I think about the five senses, of course, the sixth sense, meaning that extrasensory. As far as your five senses are concerned, the base senses, what about touch and let's just say the sensitivity associated with your sense of touch versus the average person that doesn't necessarily have to rely on it as much? Can you speak to that?
Well, I mean, my sense of touch is also highly developed. It's developed in the brain. We have research, for example, that shows that auditory development is highly that auditory processing is highly developed in blind individuals who use their auditory senses, and the same with touch. We have research that shows, for example, that proficient Braille readers have something like 22% more capacity in terms of touch sensitivity than people who are not proficient Braille readers, you know, and you'll see similar things with the auditory system. So, for example, with I've got my cane here, and my cane, I can touch something maybe once or twice with my cane and tell what it is, even if I'm not touching it with my hand or my foot or you know, some part of my body. So I'm able to process information very quickly and to a high level of definition just with, well, you know, hardly any contact with the object.
And does that translate to a image, or?
It does, yes. It absolutely translates to an image, yes.
All right, and I'm interested also in that which translates to a sound. I mean, we obviously know that many musicians have the ability to see shapes in terms of music and colors. Have you seen anything that you would in hindsight consider as being not the norm of what other people experience?
So that's called synesthesia. Right. And synesthesia is basically the interactive cross-referencing of one sensory modality onto another. So, and in simple terms, there are many people who are able to hear music, and the music registers simultaneously as a moving panoply of colors. What's interesting about synesthesia, though, is it's not random, it's invariant. So those colors will map reliably onto pitch and timbre. And so every pitch and every timbre activates the same color scheme in the person's brain. So it's not just this random ooh-ah kind of experience. It's actually quite functional because they really are seeing what they're hearing in that sense. And there are other kinds of synesthesia as well. There's touch synesthesia, where you touch something and you see it, or you touch it and you hear it or smell it kind of thing, or you hear something and you have a tactile sense of running tactile synesthesia. I distinctly remember as a child having running tactile synesthesia based on things I heard in the environment.
Can you describe that? How that?
Well, like for example, syllables would throw up images that, in my mind, was as though I were touching, you know, an object with a certain texture. Okay. And so, as I heard people speaking, it was more about speaking, frankly, than about echolocation. As I heard people speaking, I had this rolling series of images, as though they were all rolling past my hands as I was well, little, but I mean probably up to the age of about 10. And then that experience kind of faded. And the theory is that most children are actually synesthetic, but for most people that ability just fades over time, but not for all people.
Now, is it a matter of it fades over time because it's not used, or it fades over time because it's just that's its process?
I don't know. I don't think we know. I think it's at this point in time it's because it's processed. The people who are synesthetic aren't consciously using that skill necessarily. In fact, many of them are surprised to hear that others aren't. So for them, it's so natural that they don't necessarily think of it as conscious. So I think that some people are just sort of gifted, if you will, with long-term synesthesia, whereas most of the rest of us, it just fades as we get older.
Yeah, I work with a geneticist on DNA mapping, and she talked about the fact that she actually experienced it at one point in her life as well, at a younger age, but she recognized it was different and she stopped using it. She stopped trying to practice it.
Yeah. I can get myself back into the mode if I kind of put myself in the right frame of mind. I can even remember what those flowing images were, and I can kind of get myself back into that frame of mind, but it's a conscious effort at this point.
Right. Yeah, that conscious effort, that's a hard one.
It's a hard one. And we see it with echolocation too. Lots of blind children, when they're very young, will naturally start to echolocate. What tends to happen though is we live in a society that doesn't value or encourage or support the development of the skill. Blind children are more often than not relegated to being passively dependent on others. You know, they're guided around and they're told to stay still until someone comes and gets them or whatever, you know. So they're not necessarily encouraged to move around on their own, and they're not necessarily encouraged to take charge of their own movements. We'd call that self-determined freedom of movement. And for a blind child, you can even be guided around, but be self-determined in the way that happens. Most blind children are not self-determined in the way that happens. And so a skill like this that might have started to develop at early ages also just fades. And it's through lack of active use.
Okay. Yeah, I like the expression, nature fills a vacuum. And so you sitting there as a 13-month-old, experiencing the world in the only ways that you know how to experience the world, one would be obviously making sounds and seeing how it impacts the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, why were your parents so supportive in that way as compared to others? What would be your...
You know, just a chance constellation of personalities, I guess. I mean, there's nothing preventing people from being that way if that's the way they choose to be. My parents were very young. Education does not necessarily correlate with function. My parents were very young. My mom was 18. My dad just barely graduated from high school. And so they didn't have a lot of predispositions about what I should and shouldn't be able to do. God forbid, God help me if they had actually opened up a textbook and tried to, you know, figure out what to do with their blind child from a textbook.
Right.
So they really just went by instinct and they went by common sense, and they just decided, look, let's let him teach us. Let's just expose him to everything that any child would ordinarily be exposed to, encourage him to, you know, interact and understand these things, and see what happens.
Right. Yeah. And I've noticed from your website, you've had a number of different stories on trying to, let's just say, squelch the thought process that you're anything other than just normal human. And those considerations of you possibly being superhuman and some of the other things, I guess you get it a lot because people don't really think about how the body works.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, there's a lot that we didn't know 50 years ago, and there's a lot we still don't know about how the body works, how the brain works, the neuroplasticity of the brain, the adaptive capacity of the brain. I think of blindness as not a disability. I think of it as a condition of life challenge, and that requires adaptation, like any condition requires adaptation. We're all constantly adapting to our conditions and circumstances, whatever they may be.
Right. Yeah, and I've seen that a number of different ways, especially when you look at some of the folks who are possibly, I don't want to say paraplegic because that's but missing limbs at birth and so forth, and you see them doing amazing things, being amazing contortionists, even if that was the case involving certain limbs missing. They don't miss a beat. They don't recognize the absence because they've never experienced the absence. This has always been their state.
Oh, hey, even more than that. Nowadays, with the kinds of high-tech prosthetics we have nowadays, they're actually exceeding human capacity. And with this cane is specially designed, especially balanced. I can go anywhere with this cane. I can go hiking anywhere. There's almost no environment that I can imagine that this cane wouldn't allow me to manage. And then, of course, echolocation, even a piece of technology. It's a built-in oral click. And between those two things, I can do just about anything. So part of it has to do with development of human capacity. Part of it has to do with the ingenious application of technology. This cane happens to be made from a composite of Kevlar and carbon fiber and graphite, but it could also be made of bamboo and serve most of the same functions.
Okay. So with respect to the cane, for example, when you're walking, and you talked about being able to go hiking and doing a whole lot of different other activities, when you're hiking a trail and you come upon a rut, for example, how do you pick up that imagery?
That's just it. I mean,
to avoid.
The cane follows ground contour. It follows surface contour. It does pretty much the same thing that you would be doing visually. It follows surface contour. So if there is a rut, if there is a rock, if there is a turn in the trail, if there's a dip, if there's a rise, if there's a cliff, it doesn't matter what it is. I've got the cane in one hand. I usually have just a standard ordinary trekking pole in the other. And between those two things, I have a really rich flow of imagery from the ground up.
Interesting. From the ground up. Okay, so I would imagine the pole is not touching, obviously, every square inch of territory in front of you. You're missing inches, you're missing space, and therefore there are voids within your let's just say view of or line of signal.
Yeah, there aren't too many, because I actually do use a form of I call it feather touch, but it's a form of very, very light constant contact where the cane actually does trace the surface of the ground more or less continuously, and it kind of dances around every feature of the terrain, and it actually isn't disconnected with the terrain very often for very long, and that's sort of where the trekking pole comes in. It's also gauging the terrain closer to me, closer to my feet as I'm walking. And so, between the two, I would say I actually do get a pretty constant feedback from the terrain.
Okay. So where would you say, for lack of a better term, your blind spots exist?
Well, I mean, the cane only is so long, so it's only got a practical distance of roughly one body length. So in my case, roughly 1.5 meters. Whereas visually, you're pretty much as far as the eye can see. So, there is sort of an edge of the world phenomenon of sorts. Echolocation drops resolution very, very, very quickly over distance. So it doesn't have nearly the resolution or definition that vision does. So you're doing a lot of you're doing a lot of blur interpretation is really what you're doing. But I mean, interpreting a blur is better than having nothing to interpret at all. So I guess blind spots have to do with distal information. And the further away it gets from the blind individual, the more blinding things are, if you will. And the more information you have to start making up, you have to start extracting somehow, or finding other ways to access.
So now I know that, for example, I often think about minimizing risk, maximizing opportunity. And so for every loss, there's an opportunity that comes along with that. What would you say would be your advantage over the next person that counters the loss that you've experienced from the standpoint of not being able to see like others?
Well, you just have to adapt. So the minimization of risk is endemic in how you adapt. There was actually one taken a group of blind folks on a hike once, and we had hiked really quite serious terrain. These are not simple like fire road hikes. These are full on, very rugged, single track cliffs. There's nothing blind friendly, quote unquote, about these hikes. And we did it, and we were standing at the top of these walls, and this waterfall is like 120 feet. They're the tallest falls in Southern California. They're the Sturdivant Falls. We were standing at the top having lunch or something, and one of the producers of this documentary that they were filming asked, "Is this dangerous? Is this dangerous?" And I kind of shut my mouth. I didn't say anything. I let the group answer, and the group just unanimously answered no, without my coaching.
Okay.
No. Okay, why isn't this dangerous? Well, it isn't dangerous because we know we have the skills to handle it.
Okay.
So basically, I remove danger and hazard from our vocabulary. Danger and hazard are a subjective relative term. There's no one who can objectively classify a danger or a hazard, because a danger or hazard is relative to a person's capacity to handle a situation. For most of us, an alligator would be a danger or a hazard, but an alligator isn't particularly dangerous or hazardous if you A, are an alligator wrestler, or B, have the weaponry to deal with an alligator, or C, have the good sense not to go near one.
Stay away from the alligator.
Yeah, that's quite reasonable for most of us. And then the alligator ceases to be a danger or a hazard. So, you classify danger or hazard, if you would, based on your capacity to handle any given situation. And for us, most people might have looked at this and objectively decided, oh my gosh, this is very dangerous and hazardous to these blind individuals who are fumbling along blindly, in these circumstances, when in actuality, no. The only near accident that we had that trip was one of the cameramen who was filming, and he was walking backward. And I remember thinking at the time, that is not a wise thing to be doing. And I found my heart in my mouth as he tripped over something. And, it's just one of those things. So that didn't happen to anyone else on this trip.
Okay. So now here you are sitting at the top of this mountainside with your team. That the camera crew could obviously look off in the distance and see the vastness of that which sits in front of them, and they can experience that, the visual side of it. How do you experience the vastness of an area or a place that you're in?
I think it's, I can't really compare it because I've never actually seen that. We do have students who have and who can compare that. I think it is a different sensorium. So your sensory inputs are different. If you're seeing, you're obviously seeing out into the distance, and you're seeing things very far away, and they're very far away. Maybe you're seeing city lights, maybe you're seeing a sunrise, maybe you're seeing stars, maybe you're seeing mountains off in the distance, or ridges, or clouds, or all these things that give you a visual impression of distance. Whereas as a blind person, you're probably not sensing any of those things. What you are sensing, however, is the complete lack of anything. That alone is rare, especially for an echolocator, and that alone provides this sense of a relief of pressure, the relief of pressure that comes with basically having nothing to sense.
Wow.
But there is something to sense. There's the wind that comes off from the distance. And there is the sound of trees that goes off and off and off and off and off into the distance. There are the sound of birds that are flying off and off and off into the distance. In fact, one of my favorite things as a child, a blind child, I used to love to tree climb, and I would climb high, like dozens and dozens of feet high, or meters even. The highest tree I climbed was a eucalyptus tree, so I was probably 80 to 90 feet in the air.
Wow.
And one of my favorite things was listening to the world spread out underneath me for at least a mile in every direction, because I could hear everything happening in every house, in every neighborhood, in every park, for many, many hundreds of meters in every direction, maybe further. The other thing I really enjoyed was the sound of birds flying underneath me. That's kind of a rare experience. They're usually flying overhead, right? But when you're high enough, they're actually flying under you, which I just got a real kick out of, So, but from the mountaintop, there's that. And then, of course, you can do things. You can clap your hands really, really loud, and you can get an echo that's off for, hundreds of meters away from some ridge somewhere or something. And it just gives you an impression of just how far things are. And there are all these things that play in. And then, of course, quite frankly, there's the mapping of imagination on top of all of that. I mean, you don't have to be at the top of a mountaintop as a sighted person to close your eyes and imagine you're there and imagine it very vividly. And a blind person, even a totally blind person from birth or near birth, can do the same thing. They can imagine their equivalent of the vastness of space, of a panoramic view.
That's amazing. That's such a different concept. It's a different paradigm. I'm sitting here thinking about the fact that when I fear, I have imagery within my brain that I'm fearing. I see what I'm fearing, even if it's an abstract concept. How do you see what you fear or what you experience? If you have no images from which to build, what are the images? You say a bird, for example. If you don't know what a bird looks like, how do you build the image of a bird in your head?
I think, wow. So it's interesting. It's done similarly, but differently. So a sighted infant, say, is not content to just lay there and look around and watch things. You'll notice that. They don't just say, I see it, and I see that, that's okay. No, that's not what they do. They are driven to interact physically with everything they see. Okay? And so what they're doing is they're mapping vision onto movement and onto physical interaction.
Okay.
And so for an infant, those two things are inextricable. There's almost no way to keep that from happening. I mean, we try as a society. We've hit this, hold still philosophy way, way, way too young in children, and it's quite damaging to our children. We're going to see the consequences of that if we're not already. But in terms of proper development, that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to allow for this mapping, this multisensorial mapping onto the environment. Now, a blind child will do a similar thing with hearing, insofar as they can, and so for me, for the longest time, birds were basically just chirpy things that fluttered. But they were alive. I knew they were alive. I knew they were animals, and I knew things about animals. I knew that animals had skin, that animals were warm to the touch. Many of them had fur, others had feathers. And they had feet and claws and heads and things. So, I knew these things were animals. Of course, as a blind child, I was very curious as to the particulars of a bird. Right. And so God help, the poor bird, we eventually got a parakeet. And I think I terrorized the poor thing because I was always reaching into the cage, trying to get more and more of a sense of what are you? Other than, a mass of claws and poking beak, what are you really? And so I think over time, I've touched enough birds, real ones and not real ones, and I've read enough about birds. See, language is another thing that's remarkable, because we all share through language. We have all experienced things through language that we've never experienced directly. Now, in this day and age, it's hard because, of course, the digital age makes all kinds of information instantly available. So you can just go onto the net and actually see a kangaroo. But, there was a time when you couldn't do that. And so you were reliant on someone describing the kangaroo who'd been to Australia and actually experienced one. And so a blind person, I think part of the adaptation is to become imaginal with language. That language really comes into play to paint's kind of a bad word, to help form that composite image.
So the dependence is there much more so on the descriptive language to describe those things so that you can develop the picture. That's important.
Precisely. So descriptive language is part of the adaptation. You become very good at understanding it, you become very good at using it, and you become very good at seeking it.
Interesting. There's a book that I'm reading now called The Mastermind, I believe, by Howard Gardner. You've seen that before?
I've not seen that particular book, but I'm familiar with Howard Gardner's work.
Okay, and there's 9 different types of intelligence.
That's right. Yep.
And it seems as if there's a strong dependency on linguistics, obviously, now that you're mentioning it, with the blind, obviously, because you need the detail within the words to truly describe out what's being spoken of.
So yes, so linguistic is a strong intelligence. Kinesthesis would be a strong intelligence. The ability to understand your environment very quickly through movement, and not just your movement, but other people's movements. And that's part of being what I would call a being able to use support or a guide, say, in a self-determined way versus a passive way. If you're using a guide in a self-determined way, you're reading the movements of the person you're with very carefully, and you're able to respond and react to those movements very fluidly. And so kinesthesis is part of that, and of course auditory intelligence, which and spatial intelligence. So auditory and spatial intelligence are two different things, but when you're an echolocator, they juxtapose onto each other. The auditory intelligence and spatial intelligence become highly nested, if you will, in each other.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, so normally with hearing, we associate hearing with sound, with pitch, with frequency. When you're echolocating, you're actually getting a 3-dimensional spread of auditory data points.
Okay.
Which your visual cortex goes, aha, that's exactly what I need.
Right.
And it starts to process that imagery, or starts to extract that data into imagery. So for example, in an MRI scanner, if you play actual echoes of environments to a proficient echolocator, you see the visual cortex light up and go, okay, I'm processing this and I can tell you what it is and where it is. Whereas if you just play sound sources, even if you play sound sources in similar environments, the visual cortex doesn't seem to take interest.
Okay. Doesn't seem to take, okay, so that's interesting. There's more of a dull impact. Yeah, with echoes.
Okay. Yeah, more of a dull impact with sound sources, and more of a broader, deliberate effort to acquire spatial information when the echoes are presented.
Interesting. So then recognizing again the importance of hearing and the importance of touch, what about the other 3 or 4 senses, the importance or the dependency on smell? Would you define yours as being possibly more refined than others, considering, obviously the body puts so much energy in sight, and when it no longer has to, that's a lot of energy that can be dispersed in a lot of different other directions.
And it is. We say that sight gobbles up a lot of brain real estate. Brian, one of our instructors who went blind at the age of 13, so he could give you a more visual referenced response to some of your questions from his own experience. He would say that vision is a very loud sense, and it tends to gobble up the attention of other senses. So I would say that blind people are different, though, from each other, just like everyone's different from each other, and that different blind people, throw their eggs into different baskets. They have a different experience of imagery and sensorium. We're not all the same, and different people do things different ways for different reasons. And some people are much more sociable, and they're much more comfortable being with someone, being guided places. When Helen Keller was asked about that, she said, "I would rather walk with a friend in the dark than walk alone in the light," was her response. And there are blind people who are like that. Others are different. My sense of smell is rubbish. I can just tell you, it doesn't work particularly well. I don't know why. It never really developed to be anything at all very impressive. Most of my students can smell things I can't smell. I do have students, though, who have incredibly keen senses of smell. And for those students, that sense of smell is useful, and it does contribute to their sensorium in a very functional way.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I love that expression. I'm blown away by the opportunity. I would imagine if you had the ability to be able to change the direction and say, for example, where everyone was blind as a natural condition, what would you see your experience looking like from a technology standpoint that may exist today? In other words, what would support you and other people who are blind in being able to live more seamlessly within the environment today? Where do you think we're going to?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it sounds like those are sort of two different questions, but going to the part about what if everyone went blind, there have been a few movies lately about what happens if everyone goes blind or if everyone has to be blind.
Okay.
I think over time we would just become more and more like bats, quite frankly.
Okay.
If you look in the culture of bats, in those species of echolocating bats, they all learn to echolocate. They just do. It's part of their sensorium. They're more viable. They move around more easily, more quickly. They're able to find things more easily. And so we'd obviously become better echolocators. We would become better listeners. We would structure our environments differently. So obviously our environments would be structured in various ways to be more conducive to blind travel. No one would be self-conscious about using a cane. That would just be silly. We might have different footwear so that you could feel the ground better, or no footwear. So I can imagine lots of differences. I think that early man actually had a lot of these adaptations before man became predatorial. Man spent a lot of time in the dark and had to use a sense of touch and had to use his and her sense of audition much more strategically and more consciously and unconsciously. And, most of us in modern society really don't know what complete darkness is. We don't know what total darkness is. We filled the world with artificial lighting out of fear and practicality. And anyone who's been in a real cave, anyone who has been in a real cave that hasn't been artificially lit up for, tourists, knows what that's like.
Yeah.
And you don't just go wandering into a cave unprepared. So these people were using sticks and they were using echolocation to manage in the world, 100,000 years ago.
Yeah, there's a story about one of the first Americans, dating back to I think 12,000 years ago, where her body was found in a cave somewhere in Mexico, and she must have gone a very long distance into the cave to retrieve water and must have lost her torch or her light. Mm-hmm. Therefore, there she is trying to figure out how do you get out of a completely pitch black environment.
Yep, and she didn't.
She did not, ergo the story. But I would imagine you would be much more attuned, obviously, because you're already in that situation. That would be your environment.
I'd have my cane, I'd have my clicking. That's not to say I couldn't get lost. Of course I could get lost, but I'm probably not going to fall off a cliff, and I'm probably not going to crack my head on something because I didn't know it was there, So I would say that my chances are better. I'm not perfect, but my chances are better because I would be prepared for that kind of environment.
Yeah, you already are.
I already am. Yes.
So tell me about how your school works. What kind of people do you work with? How do you get in touch with the school? Who are you? How do you accept people, especially now in a COVID situation?
Well, obviously, there are huge question marks thrown over everything in this COVID situation. But orientation and mobility is generally a hands-on, very physical skill and very physical teaching process, especially for blind folks. So you can't just, show them a photograph and say, do this. But the first part of that question is people find out about us the way you found out about us. They found out about us usually by word of mouth, by the grapevine of media, and they contact us, and then we arrange for funding. If the client, or the would-be client, can't afford to have us come out and work with them directly or to come to us, then we attempt to help the client raise funding for us to do that. And it's very hands-on, very intensive work. It sometimes takes a few days at a stretch. I think the longest time we spent with a client continuously was 7 days. It was a client in Australia. And it completely, totally revolutionized her whole ability to travel. And we work with families as well. So if it's with children, we're working with the children and adults as well, children and adults, but especially children. We're working with the parents, we're working with siblings, we're working with other professionals, because what we want, it isn't just for us, it's not just teaching skills. We're not traditional teachers in that sense. We don't just teach a bunch of skills, techniques and strategies to people. Yes, we do teach skills, techniques and strategies, but the bigger part of our work is developing an ethos, helping the student to develop an ethos around themselves that is supportive of the development and continued use of all of these skills, techniques, and strategies. If that ethos isn't in place, there's almost no point in trying to teach the strategies. So the ethos really kind of comes first. And that's what we work very hard to develop. And then there are lots of other aspects to our work as well. We do professional development workshops where we work with other teachers of blind folks to help them understand the importance of ethos development and, of course, echolocation, different use of the cane, different use of guiding techniques, because most of the guiding techniques taught do place the blind person in a passive role as opposed to a self-determined role. And so really our whole thing is centered around self-determined freedom and achievement. That's the basis of it all. And everything else hangs on that or stems from that.
And it was obviously a revolutionary idea or concept back when you first, obviously, well, you had mentioned the fact that you weren't the first one to do this. So for you, it wasn't revolutionary, but for doctors, people in academia, they probably took exception with it. Are you seeing that transition now where people are more open to new ideas and they're seeking out opportunities to assist those that are visually impaired?
We now have the discussion.
Gotcha.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that I see a shift in how things are done, because these shifts always take a lot of time, and truth goes through multiple stages. As we know, it goes from basically being violently opposed to accepted as self-evident, and then everything in between. We have been violently opposed. We have been met with a lot of hostility. We've been met with a lot of cynicism and controversy, and that continues. However, yes, there are people who have shifted. There are some organizations who've shifted. There are countries who have shifted or are trying to shift. And indisputably, the discussion is out there. It's open. There was a time 20 years ago when no one talked about human echolocation. There was a time 20 years ago when no one talked about blind people getting out there and doing things on their own or doing things in alternative ways, and being as active and self-determined as we see these days. Now the discussion is open, the cat's out of the bag, if you will, and we just have to deal with the cat. And so I think we're still a few decades away from resolutions that are really in favor of this shift, because I think in a way we came out a little before our time. We just aren't quite ready as a culture to be accepting of blind people out leading their own lives with freedom in a self-determined way.
Especially, yes, exactly, in a self-determined way, leading your own, as opposed to having academia direct the path for you.
Right.
Now, echolocation is one that's associated with people who are sight impaired, visually impaired. What about for those who are sound or
if you're talking about maybe blind people with hearing impairments as well, or deaf-blind people, I think echolocation has varying utility. I mean, one of our most responsive students would be considered deaf-blind. He's quite heavily aided in both ears. Now, with the aids in both ears, he actually hears, I don't know, better than either of us. But I mean, without those aids, he's significantly deaf.
Okay.
And so he uses echolocation quite prolifically. I think, though, that we have to go back to this being a multisensorial process, and these images are composite images. It isn't just about echolocation, and it's not just about what we hear. These are whole body images. So, and so for individuals who have an auditory impairment as well as a visual impairment, we're looking back into the whole body. What is it that you are able to gather from your environment through the rest of your body, and how do you make most safe, efficient, and effective use of that?
Okay. And so for that particular person, I would imagine they're feeling the impact of the echolocation as opposed to hearing it?
Well, like I said, I mean, if their hearing is significant, then no, then echolocation isn't going to be useful to them necessarily.
But the hearing aids, gotcha.
The hearing aids come into play, yeah. Or you're clicking a lot louder to get the feedback. I mean, that's the other option that you might have as a deafblind person who echolocates. Remember, deafness is a continuum, just as blindness is a continuum. You asked earlier if I was really totally blind, and the answer is yes, but the reality is most blind people are not totally blind. Most blind people have some level of residual vision remaining, and most deaf people have some level of residual hearing remaining. And if you have enough residual hearing, then you may be able to make use of echolocation pretty functionally.
Okay. But it's not like, for example, hearing music and hearing the bass, you feel it in your body even though you don't pick it up in your ear.
Probably not. Probably not. You might get a sense of air pressure as you get closer and closer to objects. Okay. If you had really significant hearing loss, profound hearing loss, you might feel spatial boundaries around you. Okay. And there are other ways that you might have of doing that. But in terms of the reflection of sound, it's a little bit up in the air to know the extent of that.
Understood.
Hello. Hi.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for the conversation, for your feedback. It's been enlightening. I've learned so much.
Yeah. It's been fun.
Yeah, I'm always challenged by the way the body works. It's such an amazing piece of equipment.
I agree, and there's so much more to learn and so much more to know about that.
Right. Yeah, the journey continues on. So thank you again for coming on. This is Think Different Nation, and I truly appreciate your appearance.
Thank you. You take good care.
You as well, sir. Daniel Kish. Thanks again. Cheers.
Bye. Cheers.